to this week's episode of Legendlore, where I draw and talk about monsters, characters, gods, and other things from D&D 5th edition, all while giving a small but quickly digestible history about them. Together we'll go over their history within the game, how they're utilized in the modern edition, and how you guys can utilize them in your own games. Today we'll be going over one of the more classic D&D deities, that being the blind, one-handed nomadic god of justice, simply known as Tyr. Getting right into it, Tyr is the lawful good god of law and justice in the Forgotten Realms pantheon, having been a part of the overall D&D mythos since 1st edition. Like many gods in Dungeons & Dragons, he is based off of a real deity that exists within Norse culture by the same name, as it is with other great characters such as Tiamat, Bahamut, Orcus, Asmodeus, and so on. Tyr's worshippers included judges, knights, and heroes, and he held the clerical domains of order and war. His favorite animal was a dog, his favorite colors were purple, blue, and white, and his holy symbol was a pair of balanced scales resting atop a warhammer. His epithets and titles include Tyr the Even-Handed, the Maimed God, the Lord of Justice, Wounded Tyr, and Tyr Grimjaws, and sometimes Tyr is referred to as an interloper deity, which means that he is a god who intermingles and appears within multiple pantheons. In terms of his appearance, Tyr is often depicted as a muscular, bearded man with long graying hair, and is always seen missing his right hand and both of his eyes, which was often obscured either by the use of a bloody bandage, hidden by his hair, or sometimes outright just exposed for a more gruesome depiction. Despite his wounds, however, he is seen carrying a large warhammer or sword crossed over his back, and is oftentimes seen wearing some form of chainmail or light leather armor. Given Tyr's being present since the 1st edition of the game, this means that his history and lore is very long and complicated, so I'm going to do my best to summarize it down to the base parts, though I do highly recommend checking out the wiki and any other D&D media if you want more specific details. With that said, Tyr was believed to have left his world in the pursuit of power and worshippers from other worlds, due to his lack of popularity from being the only lawful good god amongst the Norse pantheon. As such, he arrived in Faerun and pledged himself to the rule and will of the world's overgod, Ao. Due to his low power level at the start, he was also one of the few gods who was frequently encountered by mortals directly in the canon, and ended up going by many different names such as R-Tyr, Il-Tyr, and Anak-Tyr, that last one being an aspect of Tyr that was heavily worshipped within the region of Kalimshan. He would eventually grow to prominence through various acts, such as killing Balagan, the god of anarchy, helping fellow gods Lathander and Suni imprison the mad god Cyric, and eventually forming a legendary alliance with the other gods Torm and Ilmater, known as the Triad. Tyr would eventually lose his hand to the primordial beast Kezef the Chaos Hound, which sort of emulates the Nordic tale about how he lost his hand in an attempt to bind the god-eating hound Fenrir. You'll find that there's a lot of parallels that meld original fiction with true myth in D&D's canon. Furthermore, Tyr's eyes were actually plucked out by the overgod Ao himself, as punishment for not noticing the loss of the Tablets of Fate during the Time of Troubles. Tyr was also responsible for the death of the god Helm prior to the Spell Plague, having challenged him to a duel over the perceived notion that Helm was having an affair with Timora, the goddess of luck and the subject of a prospective peace marriage between herself and Tyr. Helm's death then laid the groundwork for Shar and Cyric to work together and cause the Spell Plague, with Ilmater formally leaving the Triad and the whole ordeal ending with Tyr abdicating his godhood to Torm, having lost faith in himself due to killing Helm, the god of protectors, and being so easily manipulated by Cyric. Tyr would eventually fall in a battle against demons, but like all the other gods who had fallen in that time, would be resurrected in an event known as the Second Sundering, fully reclaiming godhood as per the standard of 5th edition. All in all, very confusing and intricate like almost all Forgotten Realms lore, but I do find it interesting that Tyr gave up his godhood to live as a mortal in the end. Then we'll go into more detail as to how you can use that in your games and how I like to personally depict the character. But before we get into all that, in terms of Tyr's actual canon personality, he was the quintessential brave and noble warrior, primarily concerned with the pursuit of justice and the punishment or rehabilitation of evildoers. Tyr hated and refused to engage in acts of deceit, bloodlust, or rule-breaking, always acting with honor, truth, and mercy for those who showed true regret for their actions or were innocent in the conflicts that he fought in. Many also believed that Tyr was physically incapable of breaking a promise, and he was also known to send dogs to his faithful as a sign of his favor. In terms of his relationships, while Tyr obviously has parentage and blood relations within the Norse pantheon, I'm going to be focusing just on his time in the Forgotten Realms. As such, he served as the leader and one-third of the powerful alliance of gods known as the Triad, alongside the deities Torm and Ilmater, with the latter being covered in a previous video. Ilmater served as the seeker of peace and the endurer of punishments, while Torm served Tyr as a warrior commander before his becoming immortal. They ultimately were all very good friends that were driven apart by the occurrences before the Spell Plague. but alongside them, most other lawful or good gods could serve as allies to Tyr, namely deities such as Lathander and Suni, who aided him in imprisoning Cyric, and in contrast, almost all malevolent deities could stand in as foes, particularly Bane, Baal, Mask, Taluna, and Talos. When it comes to Tyr's clergy and worship, Tyrian priests often were known to wear blue or purple robes with a white sash, as well as a left-handed black glove or gauntlet in reverence of Tyr's lost hand. Which actually, now that I think about it, sounds very similar to the practices of the Church of Bane. I wonder if I could pick up on any other parallels. Anyway, unlike priests to gods such as Torm, Helm, or Moradin, Tyr worshippers did not wear ceremonial armor unless they were conducting active rituals or were distinctly going to war. They would often be encountered in common clothes during peacetime, their being armed only during conflicts being a symbol of how seriously they took war to be. I've listed a couple of rankings within the church itself that I've sort of consolidated and renamed for simplicity, since some of them do repeat, and how I can see them serving the interests of the church for your players or NPCs or whatever else have you. With that covered, in terms of Tyr's clerical orders, there are actually quite a few. There's the Justiciars, who are an elite order of clerics and paladins who served as judges and magistrates and keepers of order and justice within large cities. There's the Order of the Even-Handed, which is a monistic order dedicated to mixing martial arts techniques with clerical powers. There's the Knights of Holy Judgment, who focused explicitly on Tyr's lawful aspect and hunted devils almost exclusively. There's the Hammers of Grimjaws, which are the strongest of Tyr's warriors, who were said to be judged and given power directly by Tyr himself. And finally, there were the Triadic Orders, which, rather than only fighting for Tyr, upheld the tenets of the alliance that he shared with Torm and Ilmater. In terms of Tyrian rites and rituals, clerics often prayed for their spells at dawn like most priests, and conducted themselves in a traditional fashion with sermons, songs, and readings from Tyr's holy texts. Tyr's church was actually distinctly fond of hymns sung at specific times, such as the Awakening at dawn, the Hammer at high sun at noon, High Justice at dinnertime, and then finally the Remembrance of the Fallen at dusk. The idea of Tyr worshippers loving art such as singing or music is appealing to me because it shows that they value culture and things that can only grow or emerge from their efforts of peace, rather than just fighting in war for war's sake. To build off of this, while in battle or facing against overwhelming odds, warriors of Tyr were known to sing the war chant in order to either conjure the powers of their god to help them prevail, or as a means of showing their enemies that they are willing to fight to the bitter end and perish without fear. Imagine a PC war cleric fighting in overwhelming odds against, say, an army of demons, and him and the bard begin to just break out in a full-on chant to embolden the soldiers. That could definitely be a very cool cinematic moment for your players. In terms of artifacts relating to the God of Justice, he actually has a good number of them to use over the course of your games. The Balance of Belleros is a pair of magically floating scales that can produce spell scrolls if given an offering of gold or other things. The Gong of Tyr is an enchanted brass ring imbued with the power to disintegrate his fucking enemies. Yeesh. There's the Hammer of Tyr, which was a warhammer of returning that was capable of both turning undead and emitting a sun ray, and then there was his own personal enchanted longsword that he wielded, Justicar, which was created with the aid of the goddess Mystra and gifted to him by the overgod Eo. In previous editions, namely 3rd, Justicar was a +3 sword of sharpness that could let the wielder sense lies, know a creature's alignment, and see invisible things. You could also lose these additional properties in order to turn it into a +5 vorpal longsword. Now, when it comes to how I like to run Tyr at the table, ironically my biggest inspiration comes from the depiction of Tyr during the Norse saga of the game series God of War. Less in terms of his actual personality and appearance, but more in how he viewed war and the steps that he took to avoid it. In that series, Tyr traveled the world and visited different pantheons, learning their cultures and studying their own perspectives on war and peace. And as such, he took his mantle of the God of War in the direction of always working to avoid conflict and strive for peace, until such a point that war could no longer be avoided. Once it came to that, Tyr educated himself on being able to outsmart, outmaneuver, and outmatch his opponents so quickly that battles could be short-lived with as few casualties as possible. With that said, Tyr never really held the perspective that war was something that could be avoided forever, but rather saw it as something that could be managed, mitigated, and taken incredibly seriously. Everyone loses in war, and so it was his job to ensure that everyone lost as little as possible when it occurred. As such, this is how I depict Tyr in my games, and I like to use his myth of becoming mortal and forsaking his godhood as a way to emulate God of War Tyr's travels and education, as well as his being an active participant in helping mortals directly. Amongst the common folk, there are stories of a one-handed warrior who emerges to deal with threats that the weak cannot, from fighting ogres to stopping dark rituals to relieving nobles of their wealth to distribute amongst the people. These are the legends that surround Tyr, and as he voyages across the land, he absorbs as much as he can about conflict, war, politics, peace, and whatever else, in the hopes that it'll help him eventually feel worthy enough to assume the mantle of God once again. You can implement this at your table by having the PCs encounter such a heroic, nameless, one-handed NPC, who aids them in a particularly harsh challenge and seeks to learn all they can from each party member. In the same regard, he can dole out wisdom and serve as a mentor or a father figure to those who have lost their way and need guidance to put them on the right path, with Tyr listening to their struggles in the hopes that he can help them through direct advisement or intervention, rather than the indirect and distant aid that most gods provide. You can choose to come right out with it and say that it is Tyr, but I do like the ambiguity that comes when gods decide to visit mortals. Now, in terms of Tyr's aligned classes, here are the ones that I personally feel fit the most with the God of Justice. For Artificers, a Battlesmith can have a dog-shaped steel defender, in reference to Tyr's favor being shown by the presence of hounds, and Armorers can forge armaments bearing Tyr's symbols of axe, wolf, and scales. For Barbarians, the Zealot subclass is an absolute go-to for a Tyr worshipper, especially one who has the ambition to become a member of the Hammers of Grimjaws. You can also have a dog-themed Totem Warrior or Beast Barbarian, or you could even take the Berserker or Giant subclasses in order to have a reference to Tyr's origins in Norse mythology. For Bards, Eloquence Bards can make for great diplomats and peacekeepers, while Lore Bards can keep reference to Tyr's constant pursuit of knowledge from his travels. And of course, Valor and Swords Bards are great for actually fighting in Tyr's name. With his church's focus on hymns and battle songs, you really can't go wrong with a bard for Tyr. Now for Clerics, while Tyr's base domains are Order and War, I do also like to personally include Life, Light, and Peace as ones that he can also have. Life because Tyr wishes to foster life, Light in reference to Tyr's wanting to illuminate both ignorance and physical darkness, and Peace because, in the end, his goal is for wars to be avoided or mitigated altogether. I would also like to argue that Order is a bit too mind-control-y for Tyr's tastes, so I try to omit it or only give it to Tyr's priests who are more keen on peace through domination rather than actively trying to foster a natural peace. For Druids, the two subclasses that I think fit the best are Wildfire and Shepherd Druid. In war, valleys and land often serve as the battlefield and thus are littered with death and misery as the combat goes on. And thus the Wildfire Druid can wield both the healing and harming aspects of war, particularly with how fire is used to burn down villages, but also keep soldiers warm and food and, there's a whole bunch of things you can do. And then the Shepherd can literally call upon the spirits of animals in nature who are often displaced, killed, or hunted during times of war in order to summon them to fight back. For fighters, pretty much any and all subclasses fit under Tyr's tenets, though I would give specific focus to Purple Dragon Knights, or Bannerets as they're called, Battlemasters, Cavaliers, Champions, Samurai, and Rune Knights. In comparison, Monks, I feel, can really play into Tyr's perspective of pursuing peace, but being dangerous enough to end conflict fast if it starts. And as such, the Kensai, Open Hand, and Mercy subclasses are all my primary go-tos for Tyr-aligned monks. You can also potentially have them join the Order of the Even-Handed if they're inclined to do so. Paladins also kind of fall into this category, with the swearing of oaths and devoting oneself to following a code of conduct. Oaths of devotion, the crown, vengeance for the wronged, and redemption are all especially good for Tyr worshippers, with that last one always being my favorite to run or play. Everyone loves a good redemption arc, and you can even get away with an Oath of the Watcher's Paladin, who is a member of the Knights of Holy Judgment, seeking to uproot some kind of devil scourge that has made itself known. For Rangers, for me, they kind of sit alongside the fighter in that almost all subclasses can work. From a Gloomstalker taking out an army through traps and ambushes, to a Beastmaster adventuring alongside a dog companion, to your classic Monster Slayer going out and saving the common people from monsters. For Rogues, given their sneaky and deceitful nature, they can still work as Tyr worshippers so long as they remain beholden to his tenets, with my personal preferences being the Inquisitive, the Scout, and the Swashbuckler subclasses. For Sorcerers, as always, the Divine Soul subclass is ideal for any and all gods, so long as you keep to the lawful or good aligned choices. And I do suppose there is an argument to be made for the Clockwork Sorcerer with its emphasis on law-enforcing magic. Just make sure that you avoid the mind control-esque flavor that the Order Domain Cleric falls into. For Warlocks, the Hexblade is a must for a Tyr worshipper, using weapons such as hammers, axes, or swords to bear the mark of Tyr scales. Perhaps a good aligned hero's soul resides within the sword, or you can take the myth of Tyr walking amongst mortals and flip it on its head, with him being in the Hexblade itself and allowing his powers to be channeled through the mortals that wield him. Celestial can also work due to its alliance with gods and angels and so on. And finally, for Wizards, the Abjuration and Divination schools are 100% my go-tos for Tyr-aligned wizards. Their emphasis on protection and using insight to make calculated moves are too good to pass up. Although an argument could be made for the Evocation and Bladesinger subclasses, with the former's focus on protecting allies from damaging spells and the latter's supplemental swordplay. Now, when it comes to role-playing Tyr's NPCs and distributing Tyr-aligned quests, for the former, these NPCs should look to embody their god's teachings in any way that they can, using their varied gifts in order to accomplish the same goal, being the pursuit of true justice and the avoidance of war and conflict through peace and negotiation. And as such, the NPC would be willing to talk and compromise on fair dealings, but will absolutely refuse to deal with tyranny, oppression, or malevolence for its own sake. And who better to do that than the god himself? When I run my games, I sometimes like to roll for a chance to see if the PCs will happen upon Tyr himself over the course of their travels, at which point he will always sort of be in the midst of some heroic deed, such as helping farmers fight against raiding lizardmen, or saving a kidnapped villager from a group of cultists. It gives the PCs a temporary ally and can make for some great roleplay if done correctly, mainly in that Tyr wishes to both learn what he doesn't know and teach what he does know to others in the hopes that they can be prepared for the path that they tread. Separate from that, Tyr's love of dogs and use of them as symbols kinda got me thinking, what about the dog or canine-based races in the game world, such as werewolves or gnolls or even kobolds if you go with the classic dog type rather than the lizard one? What if you have a werewolf who worships Tyr and dedicates themselves to controlling their transformation and using the powers that they get from it for good? Or what if you have a gnoll desperately trying to break from the shackles of the demon lord Yinagu in order to serve a better, more good-aligned master? Even a good-aligned mercenary company entirely composed of dog kobolds that are surprisingly effective can help turn the tide of a siege or crucial battle. All this is to present the concept of a dog person or dog people who worship Tyr. It's simple, a little dumb, but can definitely be very fun if executed well. Think of characters like Blythe from Elden Ring, Remus Lupin from Harry Potter, or even kobolds from the anime Dungeon Meshi, all working to control the madness that their conditions bring in order to use the strength and power it gives them in the pursuit of Tyr's tenets. And finally, there's the Tyrian Troop, which is a group of bards dedicated to the worship of Tyr, existing not to fight in wars or cultivate peace like his normal clergy is, but to instead preserve history, culture, art, and artifacts that, if left unattended, could be altered, sold, or destroyed due to the surrounding conflict. This order would consist of bards, clerics, and wizards, and their quests would focus on the acquiring and the protection of things of cultural importance, such as libraries, paintings, writings, and other pieces of art and history. This also kind of helps prevent Tyr's clergy from just becoming another center of only martial classes such as fighters and paladins and so on, which is a trap that I feel like a lot of gods tend to fall into. Lastly, in terms of magic items, here are a few that I feel match very well with Tyr's tenets, aesthetic, and iconography, and can serve as great rewards to give to your players over the course of the game. And then, for a homebrew magic item this evening, we have the Hammer of the Hymns. The Hammer of the Hymns is a +3 warhammer that deals an additional 1d6 radiant damage on a successful hit. It also returns to the wielder's hand when thrown at the end of their turn, with a throwing range of up to 30 feet or up to 60 feet with a disadvantage on the attack roll. Once per short rest, the hammer can be slammed against the ground to emit a gong-like sound as a bonus action. All allies who hear this noise then gain a +3 bonus to all rolls that they make on their turn. And once all allies have taken a turn after this ability was activated, the hammer's bonus decreases to a +2 until the next long rest. You can repeat this action again after a short rest, granting your allies a +2 bonus and then it falling to a +1 bonus on the next short rest. If the Warhammer's bonus is ever reduced to 0, roll 1d20, and on a 1, the item is destroyed. Once again, the item is a little bit simple and focuses primarily on bolstering bonuses to rolls and hits and so on and so forth, but I do feel it could be very useful if your game tends to have very frequent short rests and a lot of combat or other resource draining obstacles. But with that, that's our coverage of the god Tyr, everybody. I want to thank all of you guys for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, subscribe, and press the little bell icon to be notified of future videos. And also let me know in the comments how you guys have encountered Tyr if you're a player, how you've used Tyr in your games if you're a dungeon master, whether or not you agree or disagree with my perspective on the god, and also what you guys would like to see in upcoming videos. But until then, I'll see you guys next time.